When you hear the word audit, does your heart start racing? Maybe you're thinking of a tax audit, which is good for the nation, but scary for the individual taxpayer. When Jennifer Morrell and Matt Masterson hear the word audit, their hearts might race too, but with excitement. And that's because Jennifer and Matt are election administration experts of the highest caliber. And one of the most exciting things in their world is post-election audits. So fortunately, they're with us today on this webinar. I'm Mandy Zock, a policy specialist in NCSL's Elections and Redistricting program, and our goal today is to make these kinds of audits exciting for you too, or if not exciting, to at least demystify audits. And we're going to do that by taking a high-level look and then going into a bit of detail. And we want your questions along the way, so you can go ahead and put those in the Zoom chat as they come to you, and we'll address them at the end. Otherwise, we ask that audience members keep themselves on mute. So Matt, let's get started with you. You've had a number of roles in elections, including serving as a Republican member and chairperson of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, as the state election director in Ohio, and as a senior cybersecurity advisor at CISA. And for those who don't know their acronyms, that's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. So can you set the stage for us? Tell us a little bit about the general role of an audit, why these are becoming ever more popular, including this year's enactment to create a pilot project in Texas for risk limiting audits. I know we'll define what a risk limiting audit is later, but you get the idea. What's the big picture around audits here?
Yeah, Mandy, thank you. And thank you to NCSL for the opportunity to talk to the folks on this webinar. I am excited to talk about audits, which may say more about me than anything else. But this is an area of election administration that quite frankly, we've seen grow and improve upon at rapid rates, perhaps faster than any other area of election administration than the time that I've been in elections. When I started in elections, which was in the 2005, 2006 range, audits were done in some jurisdictions. Some states had existing requirements around them, but they weren't widely used, and they weren't efficient or largely effective. They were something that many states did, some states well, but most didn't understand the purpose. They said, basically, well, we have recounts. If it's close, we'll recount the election. It's fine. But in fact, auditing our election and the variety of different types of audits is incredibly important to the elections. Audits can serve multiple purposes. Most of the time, when we talk about election audits, what we're talking about is post-election audits. The purpose of a post-election audit is to verify the accuracy of the vote tally result of the election. So in some states, you see that they'll sample a certain percentage of ballots, 2%, 5%, whatever the case may be. And in other states, they have varying ways of doing this. The purpose is to assess the accuracy of the voting equipment, that the tallying was correct, that the aggregation of vote totals reached an accurate result. But there's many different kinds of audits that we see across elections beyond just the post-election audit. You can have process audits where you go through and look at your controls, your processes, your procedures, and evaluate both the effectiveness, the efficiency, and areas for improvement. You can have legal audits where you apply and look at the laws in place to make sure that you're implementing laws as intended, and that in fact your election office is in legal compliance with all applicable statutes and laws. You can have access audits where states, counties will literally go out to every polling place and assess, do we meet the requirements of the ADA, state law, but also best practice to ensure enfranchisement of voters with disabilities and just voters generally around polling places. You can have what's called configuration audits. We conducted one of those in Ohio where we literally went out and looked at every voting system in the state to ensure that it was still in the certified configuration. That is, it was set up, loaded with the correct software, firmware, and hardware for the certified configuration that the state said it had to be in, and ensuring the accuracy of that. You could also have what's talked about pretty often right now, a forensic audit. And a forensic audit has a very specific definition. Forensic audit means looking at the overall evidence and information, including whether it's the voting systems, voter reg, or otherwise, to ensure the correctness of the administration of the election. So you don't just evaluate processes or procedures, but you begin to look at each piece of evidence, ballot manifest, chain of custody, voting system results tapes, items like that, to dig into the evidence to ensure accuracy. All of these audits, however, mean something. The word audit means something. It means, first, consistency, that you could repeat these audits in multiple places or at multiple times consistently using published and understandable policies and procedures. Audits aren't something that you could just make up on the fly and wing, but in fact, those to be audited understand what's going to take place. Those to conduct the auditing understand and can document each step of the audit, so that when there are findings and results, you can go back and recreate those if necessary. The folks being audited and the auditors can go back through and say, okay, you have a finding. How did you reach that finding? What processes, procedures, systems did you use to reach that finding? And how do we understand that better? In elections, there's always transparency around audits. Anything done in elections, you open up and allow either bipartisan teams, bipartisan participation, whatever the case may be, to allow for a transparent, consistent process. And then it's repeatable so that you can do it on a consistent, so that as you get results, as you make improvements, as you adjust your controls, policies, and procedures, the next time you're audited using the same repeatable processes, you understand, did those policy improvements, system improvement, process improvements take hold, and where else can we get better? So that's a general overview, and Jennifer will give much more detail about specific approaches that we take in elections. And I appreciate it, Mandy.
Great, thanks, Matt. It really sounds like audits are actually a standard part of, standard practice in accounting and government. They're becoming much more of a standard practice in elections too. So I want to turn to Jennifer Morell now. She's been a local election official in both Utah and Colorado, consultant with the elections group, and is the nation's foremost expert on verifying election results, and that includes all things audits. Jennifer, I am pretty sure that all states verify their election results. Right? After counting, all states have some kind of canvassing or certifying process, right? Absolutely. So one of my colleagues will put NCSL's resource after the voting ends into the chat, which has more details on canvassing and certification. But of course, there's more that can be done, and that's to do a post-election audit. In other words, to look after the fact at how the election was conducted and to verify that the outcome was the right one. So we also have a webpage on post-election audits. A number of states, the majority of states, have some form of a post-election audit, and that makes it seem like they're commonplace, but they aren't actually all the same. In fact, this can be kind of confusing terrain. So Jennifer, would you take it away and explain the lay of the land right now?
I would love to. It's been a really interesting point of conversation, actually. As Matt said, we've been talking a lot about audits over the last few years. And quite often we come to this point where we say, is this one of those areas in election law where we might want to consider having some sort of national standard or having some sort of national best practice, because there is quite a bit of variety. So I'm going to go over a couple of different states that I've highlighted here, just to sort of give you a sense of the flavor for how different post-election audits are conducted. So we'll start with two. They're actually not audits necessarily, but they're a post-election logic and accuracy test. So North Dakota and Wyoming. Just as a refresher for everybody, all election offices across the country prior to running their election are required to do a pre-election logic and accuracy test. And essentially what they're doing is they're ensuring that the voting equipment operated the way it's been programmed, that it's reading ballots correctly for each and every candidate, each and every race. North Dakota and Wyoming do this after the election to ensure that nothing has changed. Nobody has manipulated that system since the pre-election testing was done. So it's a good way to sort of go back afterwards and validate that that's operating correctly. Then we have this little bit of landscape, and Matt sort of touched on it, between sampling ballots and reviewing those and doing a compliance audit. So I'll actually start with Arizona and New Mexico. Coincidentally, they're next to each other. They have something that I often refer to as like a hybrid style audit, sort of a hybrid between a traditional post-election audit, where we take a fixed percentage of ballots or fixed number of ballots and review those for accuracy. In Arizona, they take 2% of the precincts or 2% of the vote centers, and their state audit board designates a margin for errors. So assuming once they do that review, if they have not exceeded that margin of error rate, and it's very, very tight. There's not a lot of tolerance there. It's just a couple of ballots that can be off. The audit's good and it's completed. But what's really cool about this particular type of audit is if there are discrepancies, the audit is designed then to escalate. So they have to recount the ballots that were selected for audit. If there are still discrepancies, they have to sample more, and ultimately it can end up in a full hand recount. And the precincts are randomly selected, which is a best practice across the board. So that's sort of one flavor. New Mexico's is very similar, but the difference there is they actually have adopted sort of a table of margin outcomes, and depending on the closeness or wideness of the margin, they have preset the percentage or the number of precincts that will be selected. It is done, again, across all counties. And what's interesting, and also like Arizona, it's designed to expand. So if there are discrepancies, if there are issues, the audit is designed to continue to sample until they either feel confident or they've done a full hand recount. What I like about New Mexico, and we'll talk a little bit, I think later on when we talk about best practices, we'll talk about just national standards across the country for certified auditors of any type. There's a professional sort of auditing organizations across the country. And New Mexico actually employs a CPA firm that does professional auditing and adheres to those standards to review their audit practices. So that's kind of interesting. Matt mentioned compliance audits. So we kind of like put our focus on Michigan here. Michigan looks at all of those procedural things. It does happen after the election. Oh, and sorry, I should mention Arizona and New Mexico, those both happen prior to Canvas or prior to certification. So that audit is done ahead of time. So there is an issue or discrepancy. We go through that full review, that full hand count prior to certification. Michigan post-election does a compliance audit, and it's very extensive. And just so everybody knows, this is not meant to be a real deep dive into all of these states' laws. And if hopefully it just sort of tickles your interest. This is meant to sort of illustrate that we have audits happening everywhere and get you to go to NCSL's webpage, because they've done a great job at like providing all the statutory references so you can get to learn more. But Michigan, when they go in and do their these procedural audits or these compliance audits, they actually look at processes that required both pre-election, during the election, and post-election, making sure reconciliation forms were completed correctly, logic and accuracy testing was done correctly, and sort of all the things that they've outlined in their manual for conducting an election were complied with or were done according to the law. The last two that I'll mention, New Jersey is kind of a funny state where they had a law put on the books years ago, back in 2008. I think at the time they thought it was a risk limiting audit law. It's not quite, and they have not been able to get that changed legislatively. And so they take more of a traditional approach where they examine 2% of election districts. What I love about New Jersey, though, is that the Attorney General's office does appoint an audit board, and it's required that at least 2 members of that audit board have verifiable sort of professional experience in statistics and in auditing. So that's really helpful. The last state I have highlighted here in yellow is Colorado. They do risk limiting audits, and we'll talk a little bit more about those here in just a minute. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of a flavor of what's happening across the country.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So Matt, having heard this part of Jennifer's presentation and just hearing about the different election audits, does this give you a sense of optimism about the quality of elections across the states?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Again, as Jennifer highlighted, as the NCSL resource, and I cannot tout that enough. I can't tell you the number of times I go to that or went to that when I was at Homeland Security to understand how a specific state does auditing and conducts audits on the election. It's so good. But it gives me a lot of optimism because it's an area, again, where we've seen so much improvement, where we've seen expansion of auditing principles and techniques beyond just the post-election environment into pre-election policies and procedures, evaluations of voting systems and otherwise to ensure the accuracy of the election. And an area that I think we can continue to grow. There is so much that goes into running an election from start to finish. So much, starting with voter registration and voter registration list maintenance and being able to audit that all the way through to tabulation and ensuring the accuracy of the results. We see election officials embracing both the transparency and value of audits that I think it's an area, I know it's an area that election officials will continue to expand. And kind of a nerdy part of this is going to be that more and more elections data is available and can be used effectively. And one of the ways that could be used is to conduct these audits. So as more elections data becomes available, becomes usable, a lot of times it was just in PDFs and unusable. What we're seeing is election officials utilizing that, as Jennifer said, to work with professional auditors, to professionalize themselves in auditing, to work with other folks in order, including legislatures, to understand where can we best evaluate the process and how can we conduct it. And two important notes that Jennifer highlighted. One is understanding the timing of the audit. If you're going to conduct a post-election audit, that audit should be conducted before certification so that if issues are found, there's a way to resolve those issues. And there needs to be an escalation path to understanding those issues. You can't just conduct the audit and kind of move forward, but you got to understand what you found. And then secondly is having the rules, the laws, the policies, the procedures of the audit set and transparent prior to the election. Determining or conducting an audit with on-the-fly policies or procedures after the election isn't an effective manner. Understanding both the election official, the candidates, the parties, all those involved, the voters, understanding how audits will take place prior to the conducting of an election is a really important part of that confidence, because then everyone understands the rules as you head into the elections process.
Thanks, Matt. That's a really good point about having everyone be able to be on the same page when it comes to an audit. So Jennifer, back to you. Why don't you go into a bit more depth and tell us about the different kinds of audits that states can and in fact have chosen to implement?
Yeah, so we're going to look again at this kind of patchwork. Here you see a map really representing sort of the more traditional as well as those that don't do an audit. We'll talk about the white states in just a minute. So those are RLA states and we'll get to those. One thing though that I think is really important, and Matt hit on so many of those, definitely the actual doing of the audit. So the mechanics of that, how we count the ballots, how big are the batches, what is the process? Most states define that statutorily. One thing that's important though, that is pretty consistent across all 50 states, is that they all allow for observers. They all have a way for the public to come in and observe the audit. Some go a step further. They actually require members of the political party to be present or bipartisan audit teams to be the ones actually reviewing the ballots. So I think that's really an important component. So just quickly then, kind of going back to this patchwork of post-election tabulation audits. And keep in mind, as Matt mentioned, there are all sorts of areas in election administration from the time a voter registers until we seal those ballots up for retention, where we have the opportunity to conduct a test or an audit to verify that the work was done correctly. What we're talking about specifically here at least over the next few slides, is the post-election tabulation audit, the way that we verify that the vote tallying equipment operated the way that it was intended to. That's kind of the thing that's in the news right now. So we thought that we should focus on that. So we have these states, and please nobody judge me on the colors I've used here. They don't mean anything, so don't read into them at all. They're simply just colors. The orangey colored states represent our states that are doing that traditional or fixed percentage audit. So they're required by statute to draw a certain percentage of precincts or of districts, sometimes of machines, sometimes of vote centers or polling locations, review those ballots and compare those to the way that the voting system recorded or interpreted those ballots. As Matt mentioned, where the differences are is whether a state does that prior to certification or post-certification. And then we, as I mentioned earlier, we have some states that have added some compliance audits. So Maryland's a really unique example where they do both. They do an audit, 2% of precincts of the ballots after certification, and their compliance audit prior to certification. So that's a little bit interesting. West Virginia is another traditional fixed percentage audit state where they audit 3% of their ballots prior to certification. If there's a discrepancy, they're required by law to do a full hand recount. They have laws and rules and regulations for that. I already talked about our hybrid states. We also have the states in green. I mentioned already North Dakota and Wyoming. Arkansas does a type of procedural audit. They don't actually, and they have a pilot now actually to review ballots as well and compare those to the voting system. And then South Dakota, they look at some of the electronic data. And then we have our states in yellow where currently there is no requirement to do any type of post-election audit. Got a little star by Nebraska. So their law actually says the secretary may call for a post-election audit. Now I want to kind of move to our risk limiting audit states. And this is the area where I've spent most of my time and I'm most familiar over the last few years. And we'll talk a little bit about mechanics in just a minute, but just to give you an idea of where states are at. So we have Colorado and Georgia and Rhode Island, risk limiting audits are their official method of auditing. It's what's required in law. We have the states that you see in blue. So California, Ohio, Oregon, and Washington. Their statute says that the election official may do a traditional audit, and that's defined in statute how that's done, or they may choose to do a risk limiting audit. And the way that that's conducted is also defined in rule and statute. And then we have these jurisdictions in yellow. So we've got Indiana, Michigan, Nevada, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, all sort of either implementing RLAs or piloting RLAs. And that's actually been really cool to be part of that. I know I've spoken to NCSL before about that experience, but certainly if you're interested in learning more about how an RLA works, doing a pilot or putting statutory language to test it out over a period of elections is a really great way to understand, would an RLA work in my state? Does an RLA work with our vote tabulation equipment? What's the workload like? What's the cost like? And so these are some things. Nevada is a great example of a state that right now is under that requirement to test and pilot and report back to the legislature what that experience has been like. So let's talk just a little bit more about RLAs, just to remind everybody. A risk limiting audit, as I mentioned, we're talking about post-election tabulation audits, so it applies just to that. That's where auditing the voting equipment. We examine a random sample of voted ballots, and we're looking for a statistical level of confidence that the outcome of the election is correct. So, it does not have to be 100%. Everything doesn't have to be 100% correct. There is a little bit of opportunity for some discrepancies, but not that would change the outcome of the election. And I know that that's an area where sometimes we get sort of caught up in that language or confused about that language. I know my fellow election administrators, we want things to be 100%. We want it to be 100% right, black, white. But part of why that's important, part of why we don't just do a full recount every time, because that's the only way we can say with 100% certainty that everything was exactly right, is if we do a full hand recount. Recounts are costly, they're time consuming. Sometimes they aren't. If it's actually a hand recount versus a machine recount, that can be problematic at times. And so an RLA or even a fixed percentage audit allows us to take a statistically significant sample and ensure that if there were errors, there weren't enough that they would change the outcome. And I think that's really important. They are useful for validating the integrity of our voting equipment, and they've been shown to do that in states that have adopted those. They do an excellent job at verifying the accuracy of our results, and the audit itself is designed to detect and correct any errors that would change the outcome. So just like I mentioned with the hybrid audit in Arizona and New Mexico, RLAs are designed, if we do have discrepancies, we're required to sample more. We want to keep looking until either we've met that measure of confidence, or if it just happens that there are so many issues or discrepancies or errors, whatever the case may be, it may require us to do a full hand count. So it's an efficient way of auditing by starting with the smallest number of ballots we need to reach our level of confidence, but also having a mechanism to trigger more sampling, more review if it's needed. Okay, what's different between RLAs and a traditional audit? So in a risk limiting audit, all ballots from every precinct have an equally likely chance of being selected, meaning we take the aggregate from the entire election and all have an equal chance of being randomly selected. Often in a traditional audit, the only ballots that are reviewed are in the selected precincts. So we may select a handful of precincts or districts and only look at those ballots. And as I just mentioned already, an RLA is designed to escalate to additional rounds of auditing if discrepancies are discovered. In a traditional audit, some, as I mentioned, Arizona and New Mexico have designed into their statute a way to escalate that. Other states have been less clear about that or are silent on that if the audit determines that there was an issue. As I mentioned, West Virginia says we'll go to a hand recount. Others are quiet on that, and there is no mechanism to sort of do anything further. And I think for policymakers, that's important to understand. The last thing I'll talk about is just a little touch on the compliance audits and sort of what happens there. I call it a ballot accounting audit. This is often baked into those compliance procedures that Matt and I mentioned. It's a really actually important sort of foundational thing that needs to be done prior to an RLA or prior to any other type of post-election audit. The great thing is often it's already done and it's under the requirements in law for canvassing or certifying. So almost all the things I've listed here across all 50 states, there's some requirement to sort of review one or more of these as part of the certification process. So that's just assuring that all of the records were completed accurately and completely. We will probably talk a little bit here in a minute about chain of custody and having a robust chain of custody, and that means verifying logs, verifying seal numbers, making sure everything was recorded correctly. The really important one, this is the one that, again, all 50 states, it's a requirement for certification. We're looking at that sort of how many people voted, how many people checked in, how many people were recorded in the poll book versus how many ballots were actually cast. And some jurisdictions will actually require you to look at the number of eligible voters, right? And that's just to verify you're gonna have more people voting than were eligible or registered to vote. So, sorry, not eligible voters, registered voters. That would be a really bad, I gotta correct that. We look at those that were registered, those that were checked in, and then ballots that were actually counted. And we're looking for a reconciling across those numbers. And then we can look at other things like duplication logs. So I'm going to just stop there. I feel like that was kind of a big, broad overview of what's happening, what can happen, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mandy.
Thanks, Jennifer. Do you think it would be useful to show the RLA video now, even though you've kind of covered it, but I think it is a complex process?
I think that would be great.
Great. I will have Sage, one of my colleagues, go ahead and share that.
There are 3 methods for conducting risk-limiting audits: ballot polling, batch level comparison, and ballot level comparison. To conduct a ballot polling audit, all you need is voter verifiable paper ballots. You know who reportedly won and by how much. To audit the contest, you randomly retrieve a ballot and manually examine and tally the votes for that contest. Then you retrieve a second ballot, then a third. You continue to tally randomly selected ballots until you have statistical confidence that the correct candidate won. In other words, you look for evidence that the winner won by a similar margin as originally reported. Like the other 2 methods for risk-limiting audits, with a ballot polling audit, the smaller the margin of victory, the more ballots you'll usually need to count. If you discover major discrepancies, you'll end up doing a full recount. Ballot polling audits verify that the outcome of the election is correct. For a batch comparison audit, you need a voting system that can provide subtotal reports by batches. For example, each precinct could be a batch, or even each scanner. To audit, you randomly select a batch, then you manually tally every ballot in that batch. Then, you compare your count to the reported subtotals. This process repeats until you have statistical confidence that the correct candidate won. Batch comparison audits verify that the outcome of the election is correct, and also provide some insight into possible tabulation errors. To conduct a ballot comparison audit, you need the ability to produce a cast vote record that can be matched to physical ballots. A cast vote record is an electronic record of how the voting equipment interpreted the choices made on each and every ballot. Physical ballots should be numbered, labeled, or organized so they can be matched to their digital records. To audit, you randomly select ballots and compare the physical ballot to its digital record. This method is more efficient than the other 2 methods since you look at fewer ballots to reach the same level of statistical confidence. Ballot comparison audits provide the deepest level of insight into possible tabulation and process errors. They also verify that the outcome of the election is correct. Learn more at techandciviclife.org.
And Mandy, we probably should have added, just so everybody's aware, I talked broadly about risk limiting audits, but within that sort of methodology for auditing, there are different methods depending on jurisdiction's equipment and the way that their method of voting.
Absolutely. It almost seems like no 2 audits function quite the same, which leads me to, I think, a question just in terms of how audit processes work. And I'm going to go off of our agenda and ask a question from the audience first, and then we'll go back to our questions. But we have one in the chat here about how post-election tabulation audits use paper ballots from storage, but wondering about how it's possible for locks to be picked, seals and cameras bypassed, perhaps those paper ballots get changed. Do any states audit paper ballots on election night before those ballots go into storage? And I think that part's for Jennifer, and then maybe Matt, you could also weigh in on security.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. Again, depending on whether a jurisdiction is bringing ballots in, for instance, mail ballots, we know that states have different timeframes for when those can be processed. Some start prior to election day, some start on election day. We have early voting taking place. We have election day voting. What I think is important though for the person that posted the question is jurisdictions, it's not just tracking those or auditing on election night, but they are tracking those as they're cast. So for instance, mail ballots ideally have a batch tracking sheet that accompanies those. And every time they move or change hands, this is what we talk about what we mean when we are talking about chain of custody. Somebody needs to document or verify, I started with 100 ballots, They went to signature verification, maybe whatever verification process, every state has a different verification process. Maybe we removed a couple because there was an issue, something was omitted. We're gonna document that. Now we have 98. We're gonna move those to ballot opening. Once we get through that process, somebody has to do some sort of manual count and document, I still have 98 ballots, or maybe we removed one because it was damaged and needed to go to duplication. And then it gets to the scanning station, and once they're scanned, we also verify we still have 98 ballots in our custody. When we get ready to do the audit, and this happens with mail ballots, we have a somewhat similar process for ballots that are scanned in person, where poll workers often have to complete reconciliation forms to document how many ballots are in their custody. When we get ready to do the audit, we're going to look at that again, and we're going to say, our paperwork shows, that and I'm just simplifying this, we have 100 ballots in our possession. And when we go to do the audit, we're going to do some verification of that piece count as well to ensure, to the poster's question, we haven't added or lost or gained ballots somewhere in the course of processing them or through some security breach or something like that. And I'll let Matt fill in the gaps.
No, that well said, and it's a fantastic question, and something that election officials absolutely account for and think about. They don't just assume that once the ballots are in their custody, that there isn't a need for that chain of custody process to continue, that ballot accounting process to continue, where you can literally batch by batch. And that's the key part to understand in this, is the batching of the ballots, so that, some will do 100, some will do 200, whatever, but you can account for, okay, there were 97 of these, two of these had to be duplicated, one of these, and you can work your way through the chain of custody to know the exact count. And so that when they go to be audited, when you pull a batch, you know the number, you know the adjudication or the status of each one of those ballots and where they stand, and you could actually track that status all the way through the process. So you could actually see the life of an individual ballot as it works its way through the process to prevent that. On the security side, there are security. I'll just sort of push service from my old agency. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has protective security advisors who live and work in every state, who can conduct and have conducted thousands of physical security reviews on election offices. And it's their job to go through with the local officials. Sometimes it's with other folks that are responsible for helping secure the buildings that they live and work in, you have cameras, that you have locks, that you have authentication methods, all of those things to ensure the custody and protection. The other thing I'll add is that many states, not all, in order to have access to ballots, particularly once they've gone through and are either stored or ready for auditing, require bipartisan access. No one singular person can have access. They typically, I'll tell you, my home state of Ohio, they sit behind locked door that requires two keys, a Democrat and Republican rep, in order to access. And that's a fairly common practice, not true everywhere. So there's lots of steps you could put, but recognizing that locks can be, picked or accessed, that seals can be bypassed. That's why you have cameras typically on your storage vault for your ballots, things like that. You build your layers of security just like you would in the cyber world, but then you also account for the possibility by having that ballot accounting, going back to that ballot accounting every single time you handle those ballots.
And I would just add those for those jurisdictions and states that do the compliance audits that we were talking about, a review of those logs that Matt was mentioning, the sort of document who came and went and had access to those ballot cages or ballot storage rooms, is actually part of that compliance process, or can be part of that compliance audit that's done.
Thank you both. I think you both mentioned chain of custody. So let me ask a question about that from the policymaking side, right? How can chain of custody be legislated? What role is there for the policymakers with chain of custody? Either of you can jump at it.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to put the spotlight on Matt and let him go first, but I'll sort of lay the foundation. chain of custody is essential, right? And it's not exclusive to, oh, I said I'd let you go first. I'm going to talk for a minute and then I'm going to let you answer the question. It's not exclusive to election administration, right? This is a requirement. Anybody that's practiced law or had to go in front of a court, right? We know that evidence is a good example of something that requires really strict chain of custody. I said I put Matt on the spot because, you know, a couple of years ago, elections was designated as critical infrastructure in 2017. And elections, along with all the other sectors that fall under that designation, have requirements for chain of custody of equipment and data and other things that are really sensitive. So it is important. It is really critical thing that we do. In terms of policy making, I think there is probably an opportunity to look a little bit closer of that in light of the critical infrastructure designation, and ensure it's one of those areas where sometimes we go back and forth, like, are we explicit in policy, or should we leave some of those things up to administrative rulemaking, and where is sort of the balance? I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but it does feel like it is one of those areas where there is an opportunity to be a little bit more prescriptive, perhaps, than we have been in the past because of that designation. And I'll let Matt take it from there.
You nailed it. I mean, from my point of view, chain of custody, it is everything as we look at providing evidence to the voters, to candidates of the integrity of the election, right? You have to be able to not just talk about it, but show it. And chain of custody is one of the core pillars of being able to do that. And a lot of times what I've seen in states is either through administrative rule or actual law, there's pretty strict chain of custody, either requirements or expectations for the ballots, and understandably, and that's correct. And less talked about or less involved are things like memory devices for the voting equipment, the voting equipment itself, chain of custody or access controls to voter registration data and lists, right? When we think of chain of custody and access controls, you could have both physical chain of custody and controls, but also cyber chain of custody and controls, and monitoring and controlling access to that. And so I think as we look at the balance for legislators, I think the first, and this is the starting point for anything, is one, to talk to your election officials about what already exists. What are they already doing? Where and how are they tracking that? But then two is setting the expectation in law that chain of custody, access controls are maintained across the process, but then allowing them through administrative rule and local procedure to kind of establish for their operation. Because the reality is, both physically and in a cyber sense, it's going to be unique to individual counties, towns, and cities because of their facilities, because of the systems they use, because of the people, the amount of people they're able to recruit or use. Some common kind of best practices or expectations, again, is that bipartisan access, the idea that no one single person should be able to have access to critical information, whether that's the ballots, the systems, or otherwise, and then the ability to log and check that you have either physical handwritten records or other like scanning in, badging into facilities, and then actually looking at those logs. It's one thing to have them. It's another thing to review them and make sure you understand them on a regular basis.
Thank you both. I want to reiterate to the audience that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. If you want to ask those questions anonymously, you can send them to me, Wendy, or Sage directly, and we will ask them without mentioning your name. And I have a couple other audience questions gathered, but I think we are going to briefly go into what we've tentatively called a lightning round of questions for Matt and Jennifer. No need to be, too brief, but we'll try and keep them quick so that we can go through a bunch of different pieces. And your answers to this last question actually lead very nicely into my first question. So Jennifer, I'll start with you. If you had one ask for legislators as a former local election official, as expert on this topic, what would you ask legislators to do? What would that ask be?
Around audits, I have a lot of asks for legislators. I think getting everybody to this place where we do we do a post-election tabulation audit prior to certification is really important. I think one thing we're struggling with is this need for independence. We know that by law, the election official is the legal custodian of those ballots and of those equipment. They are the expert, they are the professional, they understand how the system works and need to be present and a part of that. But we want that transparency. And so thoughtfully thinking about not just observers are allowed, but perhaps appointing citizen audit boards or some sort of independent body to observe, oversee, review, I think is really important when we think about using audits as a way to build trust.
Yeah, I'm going to take sort of the one that legislators hear the most often, but it really is key, and that's resourcing. In order to meaningfully audit an election and in order to offer the level of transparency necessary, the level of bipartisanship, professionalization, you have to invest in it. And that doesn't have to just mean money. It does, of course, mean money, but it also means making resources available, including we know local election officials who will partner with other auditors if they're not already auditors. In some states, the local election official is the county auditor. And so there are already professional standards for them around auditing and an approach to auditing, but making those resources available, seeing cross-county collaboration, even cross-state collaboration on providing audit resources is really critical. A lot of times you can make up the financial deficit, although I'd love to see some money invested in it, by identifying cross collaboration within a county, within a state. And so allowing for that to happen, allowing and supporting counties to do that, I think is really, really critical to properly resource and support them.
And Mandy, sorry, but I see like somebody posted a question that I think is a great follow-up to what Matt just said, in that we don't have to create this from scratch, right? We have professional organizations. We have the AICP, whatever, the American Association of Professional Accountants, with ethical guidelines about doing no harm, doing an audit where you don't have bias, where you remain independent. All of those things that I think are in use across other sectors in government, in the private sector, where we could think long and well, I don't think we'd have to think long. We should probably just adopt those. We should probably just incorporate those into a requirement for election auditing.
And just, I mean, because Jennifer, now Mandy, we're just going off the rails now, but because it's a great question from the audience about buy-in. And this is something election officials, quite frankly, right now are obviously talking about a lot, and that's trust, confidence in elections, right? What can we do? They've been handed a tough situation where confidence or trust in elections in certain areas is declining or low. What can we do? And part of that is offering transparency to the process, right? Requiring, as Jennifer mentioned, having citizen audit boards, certainly having meaningful public oversight on auditing processes and procedures. Second is having the participation of the political parties in the audit process in some way, shape, or form. Really does. People want to know that their people are in the room and participating in this. And what we have seen happen in the aftermath of this election, in many places where Republicans, Democrats, other political parties are in the room and participating, is those people that participated have pushed back on some of the concerns or educated their party or their folks about it because they were in the room and part of it. And so they understand what took place and how it happened. And so that the benefit is not just that you've been transparent, you could talk about being bipartisan. It's in fact, those people go back and talk about what they experienced, what they saw, and how they participated. And then the media, this is a fantastic question. There are necessary accesses for media that need to be part of this as well. Certainly election officials, when it comes to tabulation, manage that. When it comes to auditing, need to manage that. But one of the best things that folks can do that I've seen work in counties and states across the country, invite the media, invite state legislators, invite others in before the election and walk them through how the process works, including how auditing is going to work. Before the heat's turned up, before you're in the midst of the action, election officials love to engage and show off the work that they do. And so bringing in state legislators, bringing in members of the media, either separately or together, sometimes it's more fun together, is a really great way to educate and run a mock audit for them. Show them how you're actually going to physically look at the ballots and audit them.
That is a great idea. And I think everyone likes to take a tour of an election office. At least if you're on this call, you probably think that's interesting. Jennifer, did you want to add anything to that about media? Okay, good. Well, then I was going to pick up on another thread that Matt mentioned, which was about resources, and ask, well, Jennifer, we'll start with you again, about the cost of risk limiting audits. Like, how much do they cost in terms of adopting them? I mean, ballpark here, is that feasible for all states?
You know, it really is. It is a little bit of a loaded question, though, because, you know, we've talked a lot here today about what happens after the election. Successful RLAs really rely on the work that's done pre-election in very thoughtful sort of organization and storage of ballots. And that can potentially mean some additional cost. Often when I find a jurisdiction that's struggling with that, it's one of two things. They don't have the space, so they don't have adequate space to store and organize their ballots in a way that makes them easy to retrieve for an audit, or they don't have enough staff. And so doing that, you know, filling out all those batch forms, doing that reconciliation, doing that counting, all those things that, when done well, make an RLA go smoothly, that takes people. And if you don't have enough staff to do that, that is sometimes one of the first things that gets pushed aside for more important tasks. So there's that. The actual operation of the audit really isn't expensive. Any voting system now that has a paper trail, so we have a physical piece of paper with a vote recorded, we can do an RLA on. Depending on the size of the jurisdiction, there might be a need to bring in some extra help. So poll workers or temps or bipartisan citizen audit boards, as we see some states choose to you know, help with the actual retrieving of ballots and reviewing those and entering those. Other than that, the only other cost is it can be useful, it can be helpful to use auditing software. There are a couple of open source products out there with a small fee to use those.
Good, thank you. Matt, I'm going to go to you with this question, which goes way back to the beginning of this hour when you referred to forensic audits. So you said there was a standard definition. Would you be able to explain what, I mean, is there a citation for that? Could you give us a little bit more?
Yeah, I can follow up.
Definition,
sure,
especially within the context of elections. Yeah.
Sure, and I can follow up with additional detail, but often, so in cybersecurity, a forensic audit has a specific definition, right? And it's looking at the evidence trails on systems, including things like logs, even digging into actual chipsets and hardware to forensically evidence-based understand the operation or misoperation in many cases of the system, right? So when cybersecurity teams deploy out to respond to an incident and understand what took place in that incident, they're going to quote unquote forensically review the systems to look for the evidence of the compromise, understand where the compromise came from, how it progressed and went through the systems. In elections, we could think about it similarly in that what you're looking for is the evidence and information that shows the integrity of the process, right? So that's not always what a digital representation. A lot of times in a lot of election offices, that's paper tracking, right, of ballot manifests, of chain of custody sheets. Again, it's the access control logs to things like voting systems. It's looking at voting system logs. And again, the purpose of the forensic audit is largely if or when you experienced a problem to get to the bottom of what caused that given problem. And again, I could follow up with additional information, but the idea is to use auditing standards and approaches, right? Documented, understood approaches and techniques and processes and procedures to understand what took place and try to, you know, in some cases, recreate the problem from the evidence available.
Good, thank you. Let's see, what other questions shall we ask? I don't see any more coming.
Mandy,
So-
can I just say, sorry, it triggered a thought. Also, your ice cream behind you is making me hungry. I'm not going to lie.
It's a spoon.
But contrast, what I just described. There is something in the cyber world known as what's called an open-ended vulnerability assessment, which is when you allow skilled individuals to crack on a system to look for problems in that system. That is not an audit, nor is that a forensic audit in any way. There's a reason it's referred to as open-ended. There's not a lot of documented procedures. There may be some, but it's largely allowing really, skilled people to go into a system and just dig around looking for things, right? And that's in stark contrast to an audit where you have controls, expected results, procedures, things like that. So just to kind of, that's I guess a cyber description of something, but it's important to understand those types of activities exist, but that's not an audit. That's not what that is.
Really helpful to have that clarified. And so thank you. Sending along more information about that, Matt, would be wonderful. And that reminds me, if both of you are, or either of you are willing to share your contact information in case our audience members have questions, if you want to put your email addresses in the chat, that would be helpful since we are slowly wrapping up. Like I said, I don't see any new questions in the chat. I have one more that I don't think we've really touched on, which is shifting gears a little bit here, but it's about the relationship between audits and recounts, right? So a risk limiting audit can escalate to a recount, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So Jennifer, do you want to talk to us about audits and recounts?
Sure, they are not the same thing. And, Matt made an important point, and I'll just reiterate, both are prescribed in law. Both have laws that say this is when an audit will take place and this is how it will be done. This is when a recount will take place or what might trigger a recount, and this is how it will be done. I think the couple of important distinctions on a recount, recounts can be done by hand. So the law may require you to physically examine that piece of paper and hand tally that. Typically, that's what we see as audits escalate, and we're sampling, we're doing that by hand. Recounts can also be done by machine. So there are states that require the election official to rescan or rerun all of those ballots through the machine and ensure that they got the same results again. So very different processes. I think the one thing that I hope will be a topic of discussion at a future NCSL conference or something is, as states adopt these laws to do an audit that has the potential to escalate to a recount, if there is an issue, do we still need a requirement for a separate recount? And I'll just quickly share with the audience, the first time I did an RLA, I think we did it exceptionally well. Matt was actually the chairman of the EAC at the time and came out to Colorado to be a part of that. We executed it perfectly. We found no issues that would have changed the outcome. And then immediately after that, by law, I was required to do 5 recounts because the margin between the winning and losing candidate either fell within that threshold for a recount that was automatically triggered, or in 2 cases, we had candidates willing to pay the fee to request to have that done. So definitely something we need to think more about as the post-election audit process is transformed and changed.
Great. Well, we are at 12:59. So I just want to take a second to say thank you to Jennifer and Matt for joining us here today, for sharing their expertise. Thank you to everyone who decided to hop on to yet another Zoom meeting, Zoom webinar, and learn from these experts. You can always reach out to us at NCSL with any further questions. You can share your questions directly with Jennifer and Matt. And I hope that you'll just stay in touch. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you have wonderful days. Bye-bye.